Well, let me say again that it's a great honor to be here at this conference, which has just been superb. The panels that you've seen the last 2 days are superior, and some of them markedly superior to those I've seen at supposedly high-powered academic conferences. And I want to thank Don for that very generous string of lies that he put together. I appreciate it very much. On August 7th, 1942, there was an important assembly at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Senior officers gathered to listen to a briefing by a Colonel Sugita Ichiro. Sugita was a rarity in the Imperial Army. He was an intelligence officer who was a specialist about the United States and the United Kingdom. Most intelligence officers, and there weren't that many in the Imperial Army, were specialists with respect to the Soviets, which the Imperial Army always regarded as its primary enemy. After conducting a review of the developments of the war to date, which from Sugita's standpoint had been highly successful both for Japan and for him personally since he had participated in the British surrender at Singapore, he turned to that task that inevitably intelligence officers always face, which is to look into their crystal ball and project where the enemy will next strike. And Sugita announced that, in his view, it was clear the Americans would not strike anywhere along Japan's long Pacific perimeter for the foreseeable future. That the most likely American move at that time was to attempt to establish bomber bases in the Soviet maritime provinces northwest of Japan, and from those bases to launch a bomber offensive. On that exact same day, August 7th, 1942, the United States Marines splashed ashore at the then totally obscure island of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is almost on a bearing of 180 degrees and at a distance in excess of 4,900 miles from the Soviet maritime provinces. This briefing proved to be a turning point in Colonel Sugita's career. When next we encounter him, he's not a neatly pressed, perfumed staff officer enjoying the bounties of Tokyo. He is wearing a sweat-stained uniform as an intelligence officer with the 17th Army on the island of Guadalcanal, where he is over here, crouched behind a bush, looking out on the American perimeter around Henderson Field, and about to make another astute observation about the situation. Next slide, please. This is an atmospheric shot of some U.S. Navy destroyers in the Solomons. I've suggested variously that perhaps the appropriate background music for this would be something called Anchors Awry, since it is the most difficult, most bloody, and most interesting campaign the U.S. Navy ever fought. Next slide, please. And the reason why there was a campaign was not due to a vast number of historical forces. It was due to this man you see here, Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. It is believed in some quarters that this is the only photograph of Admiral King taken during World War II where he is smiling. The official caption purports that this was taken during a reunion of his Naval Academy class. I've always thought that this was King kicking back after a hard day in one of his favorite occupations, which is watching a naval officer being flogged for talking to a reporter. You see listed there the thinking that was central to why King urged and the other members, or actually General Marshall, agreed to a campaign that would involve Guadalcanal. This was following Midway. He believed it was absolutely essential to follow up immediately. He was, as has been argued, perhaps the first member of the Joint Chiefs who sort of fully comprehend what that great American industrial might would actually mean in terms of the war, that it would permit offensive action in the Pacific as well as in Europe. As Mark Stoller has argued, there's also some interesting background in the sense that one of the reasons why the Army goes along with this is because the Army, General Marshall, being frustrated about his proposed campaigns against in Northwest Europe in 1942, sees Guadalcanal as a means of keeping the Japanese occupied and thereby off the back of the Soviets, so it therefore has a global implication. And finally, General MacArthur had proposed his own operations, and of course, Admiral King was not about to bureaucratically turn over warfare in the Pacific to General MacArthur. Next slide, please. This, once again, will orient you to the theater. You'll be gratified to notice that Rabal has not moved during lunch. The area between the Solomon Islands is called the slot. And of course, you'll see down there near the lower right-hand corner, Guadalcanal, and the dot for Henderson Field, the airfield on Guadalcanal, which was the key aspect of the campaign, and the surrounding area. Now, next slide. The operation is ordered on 2 July 42. We talked a little bit about that this morning. It's a three-phase operation. The first part initially is the order is to seize Tulagi and adjacent positions. It doesn't even mention Guadalcanal. And then, of course, the second phase going up to Solomons and on New Guinea. And the third phase, of course, the ultimate target being Rabal for the campaign. Next slide. This is the modest assessment of the Marine Corps official history concerning the circumstances under which the operation is launched. I appreciate the understatement. So let's go over the operational checklist to see why they made this comment. Next slide, please. Of course, we knew next to nothing the Marines and later the Army would execute the entire campaign without a map of Guadalcanal. Next, please. The planning process, because the operation was ordered on 2 July, the landing takes place on 7 August. There's an enormous amount of transit time. There's no time for an orderly sequential planning process. Everyone is planning simultaneously at all levels. Unfortunately, the staff of the 1st Marine Division proves to be extremely astute in their plans, which are really the backbone to what happens in the initial phase. Next, please. The rehearsal is a bust. The area selected by map for the rehearsal is bounded by a reef, and it's not anything like they wanted to have. Next, please. There's a commander's conference, which the local theater commander, South Pacific Theater, is under an admiral named Robert Gormley. And Gormley, for reasons that are mystifying to this very day, does not bother to show up for the commander's conference. And there's a good deal of strife engendered basically by the haste by which the operation is mounted. Next, please. And finally, we have what I think is the origins of a phrase that later became famous with respect to logistics. Famously, a naval officer who was heavily involved in the very sophisticated planning that will take place in 44-45 told historian post-war that basically had anyone who understood logistics as they did in 44-45 been asked to take a look at the plan for Guadalcanal, they would have pronounced it impossible. So that is how the whole operation is set up. Next, please. Nonetheless, the operation launched on 7 August, achieves strategic, operational, and tactical surprise. The Marines move smartly to seize their initial objectives. They have a significant fight on Tulagi and some adjacent islands. Alan Millett's going to talk about the ground campaign, so I'm going to slide over those pretty cursorily in this presentation. The one great problem during these initial 2 days is the unloading of the transports with the supplies lags way behind schedule for a variety of reasons, and it's not where it was intended to be. Next slide, please. And this brings us to what I call the truth about Frank Jack Fletcher. I would highly recommend a wonderful book by John Lundstrom, Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, which I think not only is a tremendous restoration of the reputation of Frank Jack Fletcher, but is an extraordinarily insightful commentary on Pacific Command in the first year of the war. And Fletcher is usually depicted in the history, or was depicted in the history, including when I wrote my version of it, as sort of a heavy in this that he pulls out and leaves the Marines dangling, which I believe is still taught in Mother's Milk to Marines or whatever. A very complex story reduced to the simple elements is that Fletcher only knew what was happening at Guadalcanal based on the operations plan he'd been given by Turner. Turner never communicated to Fletcher in any message that got through to him exactly what was really going on about the delayed unloading. And Fletcher, unlike other commanders up the chain, was convinced right from when the operation was ordered that the Japanese would react violently to this American initiative and that he would be facing another major carrier battle to help hold and secure Guadalcanal. And he deemed it essential by the end of the second day that he preserve his carriers and the dwindling number of aircraft for which no replacements were in sight because of the logistical setup for the whole campaign. Now, he pulls the carriers back, and then a energetic Japanese admiral, commander of the 8th Fleet, Admiral Mikawa, with great enterprise and no little level of luck, This is the first moment in what will be a repeated pattern in this campaign of these incredible oscillations in fortune, of luck, if you will. Makawa gathers a task force together at Rabaul, steams down the slot, and surprises the American and Australian covering force off Savo Island. Next slide, please. He simply makes a loop around Savo with his task force, which nonetheless gets sort of split up, but in the most humiliating defeat at sea by the U.S. Navy, and certainly in World War II, not its history, 3 U.S. heavy cruisers and the Australian heavy cruiser Canberra are sunk by Makawa. But Makawa, believing he's really accomplished what he needs to accomplish, pulls out without destroying the transports, thus granting a bounty to the Americans that he shouldn't have. Next, please. What's interesting is that because as I indicated when I mentioned Sugita, I mean, he indicated the basic framework, which is that while they expected the Americans to do something, it would not be until 43, 44. So it was very difficult for the Japanese in these first opening weeks of the campaign to get their minds around the idea that this was a major American initiative. They therefore, and they also grossly underestimate the number of Americans on Guadalcanal for a variety of reasons. And their decision is to mop up the situation. They're going to send this battle group, sort of a reinforced regiment, under a colonel named Ichiki. This unit was initially designated to stage the landing on Midway. Ichiki is a firebrand of average firebrand order, which is the standard order in the Imperial Army. He arrives on Guadalcanal, ported down by some destroyers. In the meantime, next slide. Because of, once again, the way the operation is launched, even though the Marines have occupied the airfield and had it ready early on in the first days after the landing, there are no aircraft to occupy it until the 20th of August, when the first aircraft, two Marine squadrons, a fighter and dive bomber squadron, are flown in off an escort carrier. And what's significant in terms of long range and indeed in American military history is these initial aircraft are going to be the part of what's eventually going to be called the Cactus Air Force. Cactus was a code name for Guadalcanal. And in the course of the campaign, those Marine aircraft are going to be joined by Navy aircraft, by Army Air Force aircraft, and what will, by force of circumstance rather than brilliant planning or prearrangement, will become the first truly integrated operation, I think, in American military history. Now, next, please. Ichiki launches this attack. You heard some of the oral history discussion of this. I'm sorry, we skipped over the back one. Yeah, just very briefly, he marches down the beach and lunges right into the one prepared position that the Marines have right near the beach. Had he bothered to go inland only a few hundred yards, he would have found an open flank, and the Marines counterattack and annihilate his unit. Next, please. I would argue that this action, called the Battle of the Tenarue, had enormously greater significance than the number of participants would indicate. Shortly before this action, a Marine patrol is ambushed, and from that, the survivors' reports, it becomes clear to the Marines that the Japanese don't seem to be taking prisoners. Then in the aftermath of this battle, there are a number of episodes of Japanese, although wounded and Marines are attempting to take them prisoner or corpsmen are attempting to treat them, they attempt to kill the Marines or sailors who are trying to aid them. Because at this point in the war, every other American who engaged the Japanese on ground was either dead or a prisoner of the Japanese. There was no institutional understanding of what it meant to fight the Japanese. It was this action at the Tenarue and this patrol action that really set the cast for how the rest of the Pacific War was going to be fought, in the sense that the Japanese battle ethics of no surrender were going to move this the campaigns in the Pacific to a level of savagery that would not be really matched in the European theaters that the Americans would fight in. Now, next please. As Admiral Fletcher anticipated, the Japanese do react. They attempt to move in reinforcements, cover it with fleet carriers, and they bring on the third major carrier battle of 1942 called the Battle of Eastern Solomons. Fletcher, there's a lot of bumbling in this, as there were in all the 42 battles, but Fletcher wins through. Although the Enterprise is damaged, the Americans come out on top. Without going into any detail on this, what the first thing I think I would emphasize about this battle is, if you notice the aircrew losses, only 8 American aircrew are killed and 62 Japanese are killed in this engagement for a variety of reasons. There's one passage I'm fond of describing a Japanese dive bomber attack on the Enterprise. Oops, where'd that go? And this is the description of it. Captain Arthur C. Davis on Enterprise's bridge noted with icy professionalism the precise 7-second intervals between planes, and the dives, quote, were steep, estimated at 70 degrees, well executed, and absolutely determined, unquote. Portland's gunnery officer, who had witnessed 5 similar exhibitions by Japanese carrier flyers, left a different perspective. This connoisseur assessed the attack as good, but sniffed that he had seen better. Next, please. In these opening weeks of the campaign, a situation evolves which is, I think, perhaps unique. We'll call it a mutual siege. Next slide, please. Let me see if I can. Once again, if you'll notice down here on Guadalcanal, there's about a 200-mile radius out from here from which the dive bombers from Henderson Field can go. Let me get us over here, I guess. Yeah, about. During the day, the presence of those aircraft prevent the Japanese from bringing in any type of slow transports or whatever. The presence of fighter aircraft on Guadalcanal permit the Americans to bring in, shuttle in supply ships to resupply the American Marines. Then with sundown, the Americans leave. Samuel Eliot Morison described it as comparable to little children running from a graveyard. And down the slot come the Japanese in what's going to be called the Tokyo Express, which are typically runs of 3 to 20 destroyers, sometimes light cruisers and other vessels, bringing down to the garrison on Guadalcanal supplies, reinforcements, and of course favoring the Americans with bombardment. But the Japanese can't tarry. They take off so that they can get back out of range of those dive bombers by dawn. So you have this bizarre situation of every 12 hours sea control around Guadalcanal changes. And the attempts to change that circumstance are going to lead to most of the major service actions. Next, please. The Japanese, having tried with the battalion in August, decide to send a brigade, the 35th Brigade, in September under a general named Kawaguchi, who was probably the most astute Japanese senior ground officer who will serve on Guadalcanal. And Kawaguchi perceives, when he originally gets to Guadalcanal correctly, that the Americans have not yet completed an entire perimeter around their airfield, and that the area to the south of the airfield is open, and he plans to stage a jungle march and then a surprise attack through that open area to seize the airfield. Without the airfield, the Marines cannot hold out. And another example of the excellence of the command and staff of the 1st Marine Division, when they get patrol reports indicating roughly what Kawaguchi, where he's headed, they deduce that that's his intended objective, identify the correct terrain that Kawaguchi has selected to attack along, and this leads to the Battle of Edson's Ridge. Next slide, please, which is over 2 successive nights, and is probably the moment the Japanese come closest to winning the campaign, at least ashore, during the entire duration of the campaign. Next, please. Once again, here's the slide. Basically, the Japanese become disordered in the jungle. Attacks are piecemeal. Due to great and brilliant leadership by Edson, their parachute and raider battalions are barely able to hold on to what becomes known as Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge. They're also ably supported by Marine artillery, and they hold off the Japanese and shatter the attack. Next phase. The Americans, having succeeded on land at Edson's Ridge, of course, are up, and then the next thing that happens is an attempt to bring in reinforcements results in the loss of the fleet carrier Wasp to a Japanese submarine. So up, down, up, down. This is the cyclic pattern that dominates in the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese now have decided that this is now a serious matter on Guadalcanal, and besides cutting off operations on New Guinea, they also decide to bring in a full division of troops. Once again, they try a battalion, then a brigade, and now they're going to try a division. The lead up to this is a series of runs of the Tokyo Express, and for the first time, next slide please, American Navy intervened successfully at what's called the Battle of Cape Esperance, where an American cruiser-destroyer group defeats a Japanese cruiser-destroyer group. This happens on Columbus Day. No sooner, once again, do the American Navy enjoy success than the next day the Japanese stage what becomes known as the bombardment. The Marines are pummeled repeatedly, scores of times by ships and constant air raids, yet to the veterans who served in the campaign, this particular night is known as the bombardment, as though there were no other, because it's 2 Japanese battleships, which in the course of their runs off Henderson Field discharge almost 1,000 14-inch rounds into the Marine perimeter. This does achieve the primary objective the Japanese have, which is to knock out the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese then, in daylight, are able to bring in a reinforcement convoy for the first time. And at this point, in mid-October 1942, in Washington, D.C., among senior leaders, there is a stark recognition that this could be heading very rapidly towards a catastrophic defeat. A reporter confronts Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and asks whether we're going to hold on to Guadalcanal, and he gives an answer that goes something like, a good stiff fight is going on up there, every man will give a good account of himself, but he does not make any categorical statement that we're going to hold Guadalcanal. Admiral Nimitz, who has become increasingly frustrated over a number of issues, but most importantly from a visit, determines that the theater commander, Robert Gormley, is not up to the task. After some soul searching, decides that Gormley has to be replaced, and he brings in, next slide please, Admiral William F. Halsey Jr. to become the new South Pacific commander. Halsey's reputation as a great fighter precedes him as a great fillip to morale, and this will be probably Halsey's greatest hour of the entire war. Halsey's aggressiveness is a tonic, but is not always a panacea to the situation. Next, please. Now, Colonel Sakita, you recall, has been crouching here quietly by this bush next to my podium. He's always been, like any Imperial Army officer, well-disciplined and always does what I tell him to do. The Japanese command, despite the reinforcements they've received on Guadalcanal, nonetheless looks at their tactical situation and perceives it as follows. Although an attack along the coastal area and more open terrain would seem to be an obvious solution, the Japanese perceive this as being a lead-in to a firepower contest they cannot possibly win. They're perplexed about what to do as an alternative. Colonel Sakita and another staff officer go up to the top of a feature called Mount Austin, which is high ground overlooking that American perimeter. And Colonel Sakita looks down and says to himself and his colleague, you know, that terrain south of Henderson Field doesn't look so bad after all. And they go back and they pull out their map, because the Imperial Army, unlike the Marines, has a map. And they look at the contour lines and decide that this looks doable for a surprise jungle attack from the south after a jungle march. What the Imperial Army is using is an Imperial Navy map. The Imperial Navy map, the Imperial Navy had copied from the Royal Navy, and the Imperial Navy had failed to convey to the Imperial Army that, oh, by the way, although the map was accurate as to coastal features, hydrographic features, it was the convention in the Royal Navy map-making office that as far as anything inland, some clerk would sort of sketch in some lines in the map to suggest that there was terrain there. So the map is completely inaccurate. Nonetheless, the Japanese launched this incredible cross-country march through the jungle to come up from the south. Meanwhile, the Marine Command, which once again, you can hardly, this is one of those episodes in the war where you enter it knowing that there's a high reputation involved, but when you go through it nut and bolt, you can't help but be very, very impressed with what they do. They look at the situation and they recognize the Japanese capability of marching through the jungle. But they determine, after their experience, that even if the Japanese do this, they're confident the Japanese are going to arrive exhausted and disorganized, and the Marines remain much more concerned about the prospects the Japanese are going to move artillery within range to knock out Henderson Field, which once again is the absolutely critical lifeline that has to be maintained. So the Marines eventually orient their defenses, and the Japanese conduct feints to make them think so, that they're going to come from the west along the coast, where they're actually coming from the south up from the jungle. And next slide, please. Alan will, I'm sure, tell you a lot more detail about this, but basically what happens is on the night of 25 October, after a series of delays, the Imperial Army launches its main effort south of Henderson Field. In theory, there are 9 Japanese rifle battalions moving forward to attack a sector which is held by a single Marine battalion under Colonel Puller, who is actually occupying a sector originally intended for 2 battalions on a regimental front. But the Marine Command was correct that the jungle march has exhausted and disorganized the Japanese, and instead of attacking simultaneously with 9 battalions, they come on by single battalions or companies or platoons. And of course, the incredibly stalwart defense, famously led by Colonel Puller, and of course the famous Marine John Basilone, machine gunner, hold off the Japanese. The Marines will defeat a succession of attacks several days in October, defending the airfield. Next, please. Immediately after this, Admiral Halsey, in a very aggressive move, sends his carrier task force with 2 carriers, the Enterprise and Hornet, against the Japanese fleet, which has moved down to support the attempt to seize Henderson Field. The carrier battle that takes place pits the 2 U.S. carriers against 4 Japanese carriers. There's the aircraft complements. You'll see that the Japanese are a little more preponderant. Next, please. Once again, I'm not going to go into any detail on this, but once again, the Hornet is overwhelmed and sunk. The aircraft losses numerically seem to be only slightly better for the U.S., but you'll notice once again the aircrew losses are absolutely devastating. 24 American aircrew, both pilots and crewmen, are killed. The Japanese lose 148 carrier aviators. The Japanese lost 110 carrier aviators at Midway. So this is about a third more losses just at this. And their loss of squadron and section leaders at this battle is absolutely devastating. Now, the battle ends, and in other words, again with this pattern, we have a success on land, we have a defeat at sea. The Japanese now, next please. The Japanese now really face up to a really hard choice. One thing that's going on is the Imperial Navy, which has been going on from the start that this was very important now. The Imperial Army now comes to believe that this could be the big decisive battle of the Pacific War. They're still uncertain because of the logistics as to whether they should continue to pursue it. But 2 things really spur them on. First of all, they completely overestimate what they've achieved at the Battle of the Santa Cruz. Secondly, they perceive they're very near success. They were very near success in their October offensive, and moreover, at this point, as a result of policies in Washington, where we begin having far more candid reports about what the actual situation is on Guadalcanal, the Japanese are also monitoring those and conclude that because they were very near success in October, they're going to try again in November. Next slide, please. Japanese are going to once again reprise from their playbook from October a battleship bombardment to knock out the American aircraft on Henderson Field. Then they're going to bring in a very large reinforcement convoy, not only with troops, but also to try to make up a tremendous supply deficit. The Americans who are on Guadalcanal at this time, who includes the First Army reinforcements and more Marines, are languishing from a very inadequate supply line, eating very poorly. But the Japanese are in still more dire situations and being ravaged by disease, much as the Americans are, but even worse, so that units that arrived early have become combat ineffective. The American intentions are to bring in some more reinforcements and to block the Japanese reinforcements. This leads then to what's called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal between November 12th and 15th, 1942, which is one of the great naval actions of the entire war, certainly for the U.S. Navy. Next, please. Interesting, the first phase of this, the U.S. Navy has never provided a specific subtitle for this particular action. I've called it the Battle of Friday the 13th. 2 American admirals, Callahan and Scott, are in charge of a cruiser-destroyer force which takes on the Japanese battleship bombardment force. There's the lineup of ships. By firepower, the Japanese have tremendous superiority, and also with respect to their torpedo batteries, they're much superior, not the least of which because their torpedoes work and ours usually don't. The American task force, which is mismanaged by Admiral Callahan, steams into a midnight melee with the Japanese task force in the most savage, close, and confused action that will take place among naval forces in World War II. The Americans become intermingled with the Japanese task force. Next, please. The American flagship, the San Francisco, is shown here in this image. The white circles represent a few of the 45 hits the ship will take in the course of this one evening. One of the hits on the bridge kills Admiral Callahan. As a matter of fact, there's a 31-year-old signal officer named Bruce McCandless who, after he looks around on the bridge, determines that the admiral is dead. Most of the admiral's staff is dead, or those who aren't are incapacitated. The captain of San Francisco is dead. The executive officer of the San Francisco is dead. The acting executive officer of the San Francisco is dead. The navigator, by one of those hits on the bridge, is blown off the bridge level and down to a secondary 5-inch gun. His crumpled body is thrown into a corner by the crew, who assumes he is dead. He's very severely injured. And it comes to Bruce McCandless that he is now effectively the skipper of the San Francisco, directing it in the midst of this battle. And what's more, what comes to Bruce McCandless is realizing that as the flagship of the entire task force, that is, in the confusion of the battle, that everyone will steer by what the flagship does. And at that moment, the San Francisco, with 45 hits, 25 fires, 500 tons of water aboard, McCandless could have made the decision to retire, and I don't think anyone would have criticized him. But he realizes what's going on and the significance of anything that San Francisco does, and he orders this young sailor who grabbed the wheel after the first helmsman was cut down to turn the ship's head back into the middle of the battle. And for that action, he's awarded the Medal of Honor, and quite properly so. The sacrifice of Callahan and Abe keeps the battleships from bombarding Henderson Field. Next slide, please. The Japanese send down a cruiser force the following night, which fortunately fires with very bad aim and misses the airfield largely and doesn't do any substantial damage to the American airmen. The following day, November 14th, the Japanese convoy is coming down because the Japanese are confident they've suppressed the American airmen. The convoy is savaged during the day, and then that night, the convoy keeps coming, and we lead to next phase of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Next slide, please. The battleship action of Admiral Willis Lee versus Admiral Kondo, with basically one of the battleships that was supposed to perform this duty 2 nights before, and a task force the Japanese put together. And in this action, next slide, please, Admiral Willis Lee is the first American admiral who really fully comprehends the ability that advantage that radar has given him, will, in a very cool-headed fashion, navigate his way through an action in which the American task force is successfully whacked down. All 4 of his destroyers are either sunk or knocked out. The South Dakota is severely shot up and has to withdraw, leaving only the Washington, next slide please, a beautiful ship, to stand alone against the Japanese. And Washington wins. And the Japanese bombardment effort is frustrated. The Japanese battleship is sunk. And this proves to be what one Japanese officer will later call the fork in the road. Next, please. Notwithstanding the success that the Americans enjoy at the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, at the very end of the month, there's another painful lesson in the superiority of the Imperial Japanese Navy. A place called Tassafaronga. American cruiser destroyer force is humiliated in an action against the Japanese destroyer force. The American losses lose a cruiser and have a bunch of others destroyed, damaged or whatever, knocked out of the war for a long time, and only one Japanese destroyer is sunk. But they do keep those Japanese ships from landing supplies. And by this point, the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal is in desperate shape. Next, please. Oh, I'm sorry, no, back one. That's what I wanted. Initially, the Japanese resolved to try yet one more time. Having failed in August, September, October, and November, they are initially intending to try yet again to retake Guadalcanal. But after some sobering assessment by staff officers, they realized that this is just not in the cards, and the Emperor sanctions the withdrawal order. Next, please. It's hard. The American intelligence perception of what's going on now, of course, completely misses what the Japanese are up to. But it is hard to be severely judgmental about this, given what had happened for repeatedly over months. It was difficult for them to initially appreciate the Japanese had, in fact, intended to withdraw. The Japanese conduct a brilliant withdrawal with the new rear guard they land. The American effort to pursue them is very restrained. The 1st Marine Division, being totally exhausted, is now withdrawn. Some other American reinforcements arrive and pursue the campaign to the end, which will come to a conclusion after the Japanese withdraw their last troops in February, and February 9th becomes the last day of the campaign. Next, please. In terms of the significance of the campaign, probably the single most important aspect is the air attrition inflicted on the Imperial Navy. What's interesting is when you look at the raw numbers of aircraft loss, 615 American to 683 Japanese, as far as we could compile it, it's not all that far apart. The combat losses are much higher for the Japanese than the U.S., and as a result of the fact that Americans are suffering a lot more operational losses due to the cruddy airfields we're operating from. Next, please. Very quickly, there'll be no quiz on this. You can relax. The warship losses, 24 to 25, but this is within the time frame involved. This is a very heavy-duty attrition on both navies. Next, please. This is the fatality total. You'll notice that the Japanese lose about 25,000, about 20,000 Imperial Army soldiers, and the balance being members of the Imperial Navy. The air losses, I report that as like 1,200 Japanese. It may very well be higher. To this day, we haven't been able to ascertain an actual number for Japanese airmen lost over Guadalcanal. We know the number is very high and involves a very high number of high-quality men. The other point I always emphasize about this, notwithstanding the fact that quite properly so, this became extraordinarily famous for the U.S. Marine Corps. When you look at who died on and around Guadalcanal, you'll notice that almost 3 sailors will die for every Marine or soldier who was killed on Guadalcanal. Next, please. Midway and Guadalcanal are clearly the 2 key battles of 1942. Midway's critical stops the offensive in the Central Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, as far as we know, had a higher level plan that success at Midway would be followed by an effort to seize the Hawaiian Islands to then secure negotiated peace. That was his concept for ending the war promptly in Japan's favor. And the carrier losses, of course, are devastating. But I would argue that Guadalcanal is the real turning point. You really see the change in the strategic posture. The Japanese are still on the offensive in the summer of 42, or at least they have those intentions. And the Japanese suffered this tremendous attrition in air and light naval forces. Now, the campaign does one other thing. In the spring of 1942, German, Japanese, some staff officers were contemplating a coordinated strategic plan which would have offered as, I think you can argue, would be the last callable strategy that the Axis powers could have followed to secure victory. And what that involved was the joining up of 2 of the most sinister forces. Next slide, please. Oops, next, boys. Next, please. There we have. Oops, now. I guess next slide, please. I'm sorry. A Marxist did that one for me, I guess, and I wanted to check and see whether you're still awake. A campaign across the Indian Ocean followed, joining up with the Germans driving down through the Middle East to cut off India and China. And this, once again, arguably is the last plausible strategy the Axis powers had to bring success in the war. The other thing, more recently I came to understand, is the Japanese also in their planning had contemplated that after the successful operations through the first part of 1942, they were going to withdraw forces and launch a final campaign to settle up things finally in China. They called this Operation Go-Go. Now, I didn't invent that title. That's for real, I'm not making up. The final point, and the one that I emphasize more and more as I think about this and reflect back on this year after year, is notwithstanding all these other things you can say about Guadalcanal, I think one aspect of it which is of supreme importance is the psychological importance of Guadalcanal, and not just in the context of the war in the Pacific. Next slide, please. When it looks like Guadalcanal is going to end up in a disaster in the mid-October 1942, the New York Times writes an editorial which reads like a eulogy. and you see the quote, Guadalcanal, "The name will not die out of memories of this generation, it will endure in honor." That perception of the psychological importance of this campaign to the generation was then captured again, and let me have the audio visual. At the concluding part of the Victory at Sea episode, this is...
Grim men, old young men, a march of men leaving purgatory. The 1st Marine Division is being relieved, what's left of it. And on a lonely grave at Lunga Point, there is a prediction about the Marine who lost his youth, that when he goes to heaven, to St. Peter he will tell. Another Marine reporting, sir. I've served my time in hell. Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Areas, flies down from Pearl Harbor to pay what small tribute is within man's province. If there was horror and ferocity, there was also courage and self-sacrifice. If there was death, filth, and disease, the Marines turned the tide of war and stopped their enemy. The Japanese will advance no further. And as the surviving Marines wave goodbye, one of the greatest tales of heroism slips out of focus into history. To these men go the honors accorded the Greeks at Thermopylae, the colonials at Valley Forge, the British at Waterloo, and now, the Americans at Guadalcanal.
This was produced in the early 1950s. It is, in my view, an accurate portrayal of how psychologically important Guadalcanal was viewed by the generation that would carry forward and win the war. That this was the path-breaking effort by the Marines and the soldiers and the sailors who served at Guadalcanal, provided the clear indication that the generation that would fight the war had what it took to prevail in adversity against a ruthless foe. Thank you.
If there are any questions, please raise your hand.
Richard, would you comment on the fate of the cruiser Juno at Guadalcanal?
Right. The cruiser Juno was part of the task force that fought that night action, Friday the 13th action. She was damaged by a Japanese torpedo. She was withdrawing in a small task force of surviving ships the following day. A Japanese submarine fired torpedoes at the cruiser San Francisco. The torpedoes missed the San Francisco, went beyond, and Juno couldn't get out of the way. She was hit and blew up in a tremendous explosion, much like the hood blowing up against the Bismarck. The task force commander, or the surviving commanding officer of the cruiser Helena, examining the situation and realizing his destroyer escort was inadequate, chose not to stop for survivors. It turns out, as we now know, that there were over 100 men left in the water, and all but 10 of them would eventually perish. The crew of the cruiser Juno contained the 5 Sullivan brothers. We know that one of the brothers, George, got off the Juno and survived for several days in the water. The loss of the Juno was one of the most catastrophic events in American warship, major American warship during the entire Second World War. And of course, there was a movie made about the Fighting Sullivans, and a destroyer famously called the Sullivans was commissioned during the war. And that name has been continued on in the Navy, and the current vessel named the Sullivans.
Yes, Richard, right here. You had mentioned that radar was used successfully, and I wondered if you could briefly discuss some of the differences in technology between us and the Japanese at that time. They either gave us an advantage or disadvantage to either side.
Right. The Japanese had been working on radar, but did not have, well, except for a couple of experimental models, they didn't have them operationally deployed around Guadalcanal. There there was a radar the Japanese had in one of the carrier battles that was effective. But generally speaking, the Japanese did not have radar. The Japanese, however, because they had intensely prepared for night combat pre-war, had worked very assiduously in developing accurate visual lookout work, including the use of these very oversized binoculars, sort of crude intensification devices. The U.S. Navy had only begun the generalized fitting of radar with the start of the war in December of 41. Anyone who reads the reports from that period will notice there were a lot of kinks and problems in radar. It didn't work properly. It was fading of the power. It could be masked by land mass, and there were all kinds of bugaboos. It was not a panacea. Not only that, the early generally fitted version called SC, Sugar Charlie, was pretty crude. A successor microwave version called SG, Sugar George, was much more effective, but that only became fitted within mid-1942, and once again, there's a lot of fault that's been attributed to the flag officers and other commanders who served at Guadalcanal for not properly exploiting that radar. But the fact is that this was entirely new technology they had not been familiar with from as a more junior officer. It was still in a very experimental stage, so there's a lot of fumbling with it. Lee, however, was a tremendously talented gunnery officer who had studied it carefully, understood it carefully. And not only that, Lee had one other tremendous attribute. He had this incredible visual memory where he could keep in his head a tactical plot that was beyond what most other human beings could possibly hope to do. And that's one of the reasons why Admiral Lee was successful in battle. But radar was not a panacea. In a talk I gave at the Naval War College, I tick off, there are 5 major night surface actions, and the Japanese saw the Americans first in 2 of them. Visually, before radar detected the Japanese, only 3 of them did the radar give the earlier warning, and that didn't always necessarily lead to victory.
Richard? Back
Yes.
here.
Yeah.
Was it true that when the Japanese construction crews fled when the Marines came, they left a large store of rice and sake?
Right. Oddly enough, the official historians tend to focus on the rice. The Marines, however, I believe gave equal attention to the alcohol content the Japanese had left behind. Yeah, they left a goodly amount of stores and rice, and that was very important. It was interesting going back to the original documents, trying to figure out just exactly how much food actually had been landed, how much was available, and rice was clearly a mainstay. And the Marines only ate two meals a day, partly for tactical reasons because of the air raids or whatever, for a large part of the campaign. But the Japanese, the Imperial Navy kept forwarding troops to Guadalcanal without providing food. And pretty soon, everybody who'd been shipped there, who'd been there for any length of time, was just an emaciated survivor. A staff officer came down from Tokyo, who had been sitting back there and had been very cavalier about what had going on until he got ashore and was utterly and totally shocked. Oh, by the way, let me finish the story on Colonel Sugita. He is one of the survivors from Guadalcanal, and in September 1942, he will be a member of the Japanese surrender delegation on the USS Missouri, where he is in the photograph standing at the far left of the rear rank, where I believe it's safe to assume the Japanese were relying upon him for his translator skills as opposed to his estimate of the situation.
Right here, Drew.
Mr. Frank, I wondered if you could expand a little bit on Chesty Puller, his background and his contribution.
I think Alan will probably be expanding and then re-expanding on Chesty Puller, legendary figure who there's a wonderful biography of him by John Hoffman. I'd recommend anyone who really wants to find, I think, a fair, full, and balanced account of Chesty Puller. But without a doubt, the actions of that battalion he led that night in October that was a stellar performance. And I would also add that it's a tribute to inter-service relations, which always weren't of the very best, that when the Army when they sent a reinforcing Army battalion, the Army battalion commander had the excellent good sense to just turn everything over to Puller.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
During the Battle of Savo Island, the Canberra was lost. How significant was that to the relations with the Australians? Did they hold a grudge? Or were they kind of, okay, that happened in war?
Maybe my Australian colleagues could, I'm not aware that the Australians held any grudge over that. The Australian Navy did more than its fair share in the Pacific, even however few the ships were. Americans are always glad to have an Australian ship with them. That seems, you get that not just from the official accounts, you get that when you read the oral histories or whatever here. They held the Australians in very high regard. And as far as I mean, the Canberra is very unfortunate. There was a little bit of internal backbiting, sort of minor, but an argument over whether things would have been different if the other Australian cruiser had been present. The Australia had been there and been at the position Canberra was initially. But as far as I know, between the U.S. and the Australians, there was no back and forth about that. Although there is a book, Shame of Savo, that's been published, which says that claims that in the heat of the battle, that the torpedo, and this is all disputed as to whether Canberra was hit by a torpedo or not, but the claim is that the torpedo that actually hit the Australia was an American torpedo that was misfired by an American destroyer and actually hit the Canberra. I'm sort of agnostic on that one. Mainly, and the main reasons I told the author was because American torpedoes worked so seldom, it was sort of hard to imagine that this could have happened. Yeah.
Bloody Ridge deservedly so I guess always get a lot of attention, but the battles around the Mechanico, and Richard Greer, he'll maybe talk about it later on this afternoon, but it was so fluid there and so critical, and the perimeters weren't established, and Marines are going offshore, amphibious assaults, get trapped up on the hill, a puller goes out and fires. I mean, could you comment on the significance of the battles of Mechanico?
The Mantanacar River, which is a river which is west of where the main American perimeter was at the beginning of the campaign, was terrain over which more clashes occurred than any other feature on the campaign. I'm sure Alan will get into that. It was sort of for a large part of the campaign, it was sort of a no man's land where each side was at various times attempting to dominate. One of the important considerations for the Marines throughout the campaign was this fear that the Japanese would land artillery on Guadalcanal and be able to interdict Henderson Field with artillery, and keeping them beyond artillery range was an important component of why they were concerned about dominating the Mantanacoff. I regret to report that if you go to Guadalcanal today to see that the scene where all those battles took place, it is now a housing track, which has thus lost some of the ambiance of 1942.
Hollywood released a movie right after this battle called Guadalcanal Diary by Richard Tregascus, I believe. It's a wonderful propaganda film. Is it accurate, sir?
Atmospherically, it's accurate. In terms of specifics, I can't say too much about the movie. That does trigger me on one thing. Tregascus was one of the two correspondents who was originally on the island with the Marines. And one of the things it turned out when I was doing research for this book was I ended up effectively fact-checking Tregascus, not because I set out to do so, but because I found that I was constantly tracking over. And the more I had occasion to fact-check, the more impressed I was with Tregascus. He was incredibly reliable on anything he actually saw. His reports match up. But John Lundstrom caught one little inversion of two air battles where he apparently got his notes wrong. But apart from that, the guy was really, and in fact, because later in the campaign when things were looking extremely grim and the 1st Marine Division was contemplating at one point having to take to the hills, they destroyed some of their documents and reports at headquarters, so they had to recreate some of the events very early in the campaign, and there was at least one episode where I found a conflict between the official report in Tregaskis, and I, without hesitation, figured Tregaskis was probably right, because those were his notes from the time. And I would add that First Marine Division report also, I think, is highly commendable in being as candid as it is and accurate as it is.
Thank you very much, Richard.